Rachel Blake had spent years of her life navigating the chaotic labyrinth of city life, building a career as a sharp, no-nonsense attorney specializing in family law. After years of exhausting negotiations, countless court appearances, and endless nights spent drafting documents under the cold glow of office lights, she finally decided it was time to trade the concrete walls for open skies. The move wasn't sudden. It had been quietly planned for years, a slow, burned dream fueled by too many late-night subway rides, by the aching desire to hear something other than sirens outside her window, by the need to reclaim her own space, her own time. The suburban neighborhood she chose wasn't flashy or bustling. It was old money, built around quiet streets lined with maple trees and stately houses that seemed to watch over the lanes like silent sentinels. The kind of place where lawns stayed neatly trimmed, porches were framed with white columns, and everyone knew whose dog had gotten loose without needing to check a Facebook post. It was exactly what Rachel needed. Peace, predictability, and above all, control over her environment. Her new house sat at the end of a winding cul-de-sac, separated from the main road by a long, gently curving driveway. It wasn't the biggest property, nor the grandest, but it had character. An old oak in the front yard that must have been planted a century ago, weathered brick paths leading to a sun-drenched backyard, and a natural stone patio that had seen better days but whispered promises of quiet Sunday mornings and evening barbecues. Rachel saw potential where others might have seen work, and she was eager to make the place her own. She threw herself into planning the improvements with the same meticulous focus she had once reserved for her cases. Top of her list was the backyard. She envisioned a beautiful deck and patio, something simple yet elegant, a place where she could sit with a book and a glass of wine, away from the endless demands of the world. She hired a reputable construction company, submitted every necessary application for permits, and made sure every approval was obtained before the first stone was laid. Rachel knew better than to cut corners. She had seen too many messy legal disputes over property lines and zoning violations to risk even a technical misstep. Over several weeks, the backyard transformed. The cracked concrete was replaced by a beautiful timber deck framed with low, tasteful fencing. New outdoor lights were installed. A small pergola was built to provide shade in the summer heat. It wasn't just construction. It was reclamation, building a quiet fortress after years spent battling noise and pressure. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt genuinely content. Of course, not everyone shared her excitement. Karen Winslow lived 2 houses down, a wide-hipped woman with the kind of imperious presence that didn't so much request attention as demand it. Karen wasn't officially in charge of the neighborhood, but she might as well have been. She organized the bake sales, ran the holiday parties, and chaired the garden club. She was the type who believed her opinions were law, regardless of any actual authority. Rachel's first interaction with Karen had been a warning disguised as a welcome, a syrupy smile, a gift basket heavy with stale cookies, and a casual reminder that we like to keep things traditional around here. Rachel had smiled politely, thanked her, and closed the door thinking nothing of it. She knew the type. Suburban royalty clinging to a crumbling crown, and she had no intention of getting drawn into petty dramas. But Karen wasn't someone who took being ignored lightly. Over the next few weeks, Rachel noticed her hovering on the sidewalk during construction, arms crossed, lips pursed into a tight line of disapproval. She made passive-aggressive comments loud enough for Rachel or the workers to hear, remarks about how newcomers don't always understand neighborhood standards, and how some people think they can do whatever they want just because they have money. Rachel had no illusions about winning Karen over, nor any desire to try. She focused on her project, trusting that once the dust settled, things would fall into a natural rhythm. What Rachel didn't anticipate was how far Karen would go once she realized her disapproval wasn't enough to stop the changes. There was a look Rachel caught once, just once, when she passed Karen during an evening walk. A glance over the shoulder, a slow narrowing of eyes, the cold calculation behind a falsely warm smile. Rachel had seen that look before. Not from suburban housewives, but from opposing counsel about to pull a dirty trick. It was the look of someone who had decided they couldn't win by playing fair. Still, Rachel wasn't worried. She had all her paperwork in order, every permit signed, every inspection passed. She was untouchable, or so she thought. Her world felt secure, rooted in careful planning and legal certainty. She knew the rules and played by them, believing that was enough to protect herself. But as she would soon learn, not everyone cared about the rules, and some were more than willing to drag others through chaos simply to soothe a bruised ego. The day the patio was finished was one of those rare moments where life felt perfect. Rachel stood on the new deck as the late afternoon sun dipped low behind the trees, casting the whole yard in a soft, golden light. She could hear the faint hum of cicadas, the distant laughter of children playing on another street, the comforting creak of the wood under her bare feet. It was a quiet triumph, a space she had carved out for herself through years of work and sacrifice. She sipped from her glass, savoring the moment, and allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be the beginning of something easier. The first sign that something was wrong came late one Thursday night, nearly 2 weeks after the patio was completed. Rachel had stayed late at a meeting across town and didn't pull into her driveway until almost midnight. She was exhausted, her mind already halfway through the motions of brushing her teeth and collapsing into bed, when she noticed something strange: the faint sound of engines idling nearby. She slowed, scanning the street. There were 2 trucks parked along the curb a few houses down, dark shapes against the deeper darkness. Nothing overtly suspicious. Work trucks sometimes parked overnight in residential neighborhoods, but something about the way they sat there, perfectly still, headlights off, engines running low, prickled the back of her neck. Rachel shook off the feeling. She parked, locked her car, and went inside, telling herself she was being paranoid. But the next morning, the real nightmare began. She woke to the sound of metal on stone, a harsh grinding noise that sent her heart lurching into her throat. She stumbled out of bed, threw on a sweater, and rushed outside. Her backyard, her sanctuary, was a war zone. Men in dusty clothes and heavy boots, not the company she had hired, were tearing apart her patio. Planks were ripped from their frames, tiles shattered under careless boots. The pergola already collapsed into a pile of twisted wood. No uniforms, no marked vehicles, no introductions, just methodical destruction. Rachel yelled, demanding answers, but one of the men, a thick-armed guy with a cigarette dangling from his mouth, simply shrugged and said, "Just following orders, lady." Within minutes they were gone, vanishing with the speed and coordination of a team that knew how to avoid questions. They didn't leave a business card, a contract, or even an invoice. Just ruin. And as Rachel stood there, stunned and furious, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of laughter drifting from a familiar porch. Karen Winslow sitting back in her rocking chair, a tall glass of sweet tea in her hand, smiling lazily as if nothing in the world could touch her. Rachel didn't move. She didn't shout or storm over in a fit of rage. Instead, she stood very still, breathing through the white-hot fury boiling in her chest, letting the scene etch itself into her memory. She wasn't a fool. She had built a career out of reading people, understanding leverage, and striking back only when the moment was right. Karen thought she had won. She thought she could bully and humiliate Rachel into packing up and leaving, just another transient outsider who couldn't handle the pressure. But Karen had made a critical error. She mistook Rachel's silence for submission. What she had really done was light a fire, slow-burning, patient, and unstoppable, that would eventually consume everything she had built her little suburban empire on. Rachel went back inside, her mind already moving, assembling a mental list of calls to make, evidence to gather, steps to take. She would not scream. She would not cry. She would not give Karen the satisfaction. Rachel Blake was not someone you pushed without consequences, and this was only the beginning. Rachel didn't waste time drowning in emotions. By the time the sun fully rose over the shattered mess of her backyard, She was already working. She started by photographing everything. The splintered wood, the scattered nails, the broken lighting fixtures torn from the ground like roots from dry earth. Every cracked tile, every severed beam, every ripped garden light, captured from multiple angles with a steady, deliberate hand. She wasn't just gathering memories of what she had lost, she was documenting evidence for the fight she knew was coming. After a decade of fighting legal battles for others, she understood better than most that in conflict, the first to organize wins. Her mind calculated next steps with cold precision. First, secure official documentation. Rachel called the police department's non-emergency number, explaining calmly that she needed an officer to file a report on property destruction. She made sure to use neutral language, offering no accusations yet, just facts. Unauthorized destruction, unknown parties, immediate need for incident documentation. When the officer arrived an hour later, a weary, middle-aged man who looked like he had seen one suburban dispute too many, Rachel greeted him with quiet professionalism. She guided him around the property, answering his questions succinctly. No, she hadn't hired a demolition crew. Yes, she had all her permits in order. Yes, she could provide copies. Yes, she had seen unknown workers removing parts of her property without permission. The officer, taking notes, asked if there were any witnesses. Rachel hesitated for half a heartbeat. She could mention Karen standing smugly on her porch, but without hard proof tying her to the act, accusations would weaken her position. She shook her head. "Not that I can confirm yet," she said simply. The officer nodded, jotted something down, and gave her a copy of the preliminary report. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a foothold in what would soon become a steep and brutal climb. Next, Rachel contacted her insurance company. The representative on the phone listened carefully as she explained what had happened, immediately flagging the situation for their fraud and vandalism unit. An adjuster was scheduled to come inspect the damage within 24 hours. Good. If there was one thing Rachel knew about insurance companies, it was that they hated losing money, and when they were invested in a case, they pursued it with relentless, merciless energy. After securing the first waves of protection, Rachel turned her attention to the administrative maze that governed property maintenance in her neighborhood. She had heard stories about the neighborhood council being a tight-knit, self-important group who saw themselves as custodians of tradition, but she had deliberately kept her distance until now. Today, avoidance was no longer an option. She dug through the welcome packet she had been given when she moved in, a thick folder stuffed with regulations, community guidelines, meeting schedules, and phone numbers, and found the main office's contact information. She called, using the same professional tone she reserved for judges and opposing counsel, requesting confirmation in writing that no demolition or renovation orders had been filed against her property. The woman on the other end, who introduced herself as Deanna, hesitated, then promised to look into it and call her back. Rachel set the phone down, feeling the first faint pulse of adrenaline turn into something colder, harder. Focus. While waiting, she began reviewing every document she had related to her property. Permits, contracts, emails with her contractor, payment receipts. Everything was in perfect order. She had dotted every I, crossed every T. There were no cracks to exploit. Her fortress had been solid. This attack wasn't born of technicality, it was born of malice. An hour later, Deanna called back, her voice tight with discomfort. "Ms. Blake, after checking our records, there have been no demolition orders filed against your address. None authorized, none pending." Rachel thanked her, hung up, and sat back in her chair, staring out at the wreckage beyond her kitchen window. No authorization. No mistake. Someone had sent that crew intentionally outside the system to destroy her property. And though she couldn't yet prove it, every instinct she possessed screamed that Karen was behind it. Rachel's next move was crucial. Emotions had no place in strategy. Rage would only cloud her judgment. She needed more than suspicion. She needed undeniable proof. She spent the afternoon walking the neighborhood under the pretense of checking on utilities. At first glance, everything appeared normal. Kids played in sprinklers, neighbors tended gardens, delivery vans hummed past. But at the far end of the street, she noticed something peculiar. A small, battered white van parked half on the curb, half on the grass, its rear door ajar. Painted across the side in peeling letters was the name of a construction company Rachel didn't recognize. Gordon and Sons Contracting. But something about it felt wrong. Rachel approached, peering discreetly inside. A scattering of worn tools, a pile of old tarps, and, most tellingly, a half-crumpled work order wedged between the seats. She couldn't risk stepping inside. Trespassing could undermine any case she hoped to build, but she memorized the company name and scribbled the phone number onto the back of a receipt. Returning home, Rachel began to dig. In less than 10 minutes online, she confirmed her suspicions. No valid business license under that name existed within the county. Gordon and Sons had no website, no customer reviews, no physical address. It was a ghost company, a fake front designed to disappear once the job was done. Whoever hired them hadn't wanted the work traced. That night, Rachel hardly slept. She lay awake in bed, not consumed by fear, but by calculation. Karen was sloppy. She was powerful in the shallow pool of neighborhood gossip and PTA politics, but she wasn't used to facing someone who understood real leverage. Rachel's world was one of hard evidence, airtight arguments, and unbreakable records. Karen's world ran on favors, intimidation, and the assumption that no one would dare push back hard enough to topple the little throne she had built for herself. Tomorrow, Rachel decided, she would make the first real move. Morning brought more unwelcome surprises. When Rachel stepped outside to check her mail, she found an official-looking notice taped to her front door. It bore the Community Association's letterhead, but was oddly phrased. A vague cease and desist warning, citing unapproved structural modifications to public space. Rachel read it twice, recognizing immediately that it was not an official violation letter. There was no case number, no signature from a compliance officer, just a passive threat designed to scare her into compliance. A paper tiger. Rachel smiled grimly. It was too fast, too sloppy. Karen was getting nervous. Instead of reacting, Rachel documented the letter, photographed where it had been placed, and filed it away. She knew better than to confront Karen directly. It would only tip her hand too soon. Instead, she scheduled appointments, one with her contractor to retrieve sworn statements about the construction timeline, another with the insurance adjuster, and a third with a private investigator she had occasionally worked with during particularly messy divorce cases. Rachel wasn't naive. She didn't expect the police to prioritize her case over more urgent matters, nor did she trust the association to police their own favorites. But she understood something critical that Karen clearly did not. Real power didn't come from loud voices or public humiliation. It came from quiet, patient accumulation of evidence, from striking at the precise moment when your opponent thought they had already won. Rachel wasn't going to make noise. She was going to build a case so solid that when the hammer finally fell, it would be swift, public, and irreversible. Karen, meanwhile, continued her parade of false innocence. She hosted a garden brunch that weekend, setting up tables near the street where guests in sun hats and pastel dresses sipped mimosas and murmured about the unsightly mess down the road. Rachel observed from her window, filing away faces and conversations without anger or bitterness, just the cold, clinical detachment of someone gathering intelligence before a decisive strike. Let them gossip. Let them believe she was cornered. In time, they would see how badly they had underestimated her. The real war had not yet begun, but Rachel was already winning. She had the patience. She had the discipline. And soon, she would have the proof that would tear Karen's carefully constructed kingdom to shreds. Rachel knew that escalation was inevitable. Karen had not engineered the destruction of her patio just to walk away quietly. There would be another move, and it would be louder, riskier, and sloppier than the last. Karen was not the type to retreat with grace. Her sense of entitlement ran too deep, her conviction that she controlled the neighborhood too absolute. True to form, the next blow came sooner than Rachel expected. It began with a letter, not from the neighborhood committee or the local authorities, but from a private law firm based 2 towns over. The letter accused Rachel of unauthorized modifications extending onto communal land, demanded immediate removal of illegal structures, and threatened civil action if compliance was not achieved within 30 days. Rachel read it twice, allowing the absurdity to settle in. The structures they cited, her new patio, her deck, the minor landscaping upgrades, were all well within her legally defined property lines, a fact verified by the city records and her own paid-for land survey. Still, the threat was serious. Lawsuits, even frivolous ones, cost time, money, and energy. They could dirty reputations simply by existing. Karen wasn't trying to win in court. She was trying to bury Rachel under paperwork, distractions, and financial strain, hoping she would cut her losses and sell. But Rachel had no intention of running. She immediately forwarded the letter to her own attorney, a hard-nosed litigator she trusted implicitly. His reaction was swift and thorough. By the end of the day, Rachel's legal team had filed a formal response, demanding specific evidence to support the claims and warning that any further baseless harassment would result in counteraction for malicious prosecution and defamation. Rachel knew the tactics Karen was using. This was legal intimidation, a chess game played by amateurs who assumed their opponent wouldn't know how to defend themselves. But Rachel was a professional, and she didn't scare easily. At the same time, the private investigator she had hired returned with early findings. The so-called construction company, Gordon & Sons, was linked to 2 other incidents in neighboring communities where sudden unauthorized demolitions had occurred following neighbor disputes. In both cases, no one was ever prosecuted. The victims moved away within months, overwhelmed by harassment and the cost of repairs. More importantly, Rachel's investigator discovered payment trails. Small, cash withdrawals from an account under Karen Winslow's name matched suspiciously close to the days leading up to the demolition. It wasn't definitive proof, not yet, but it was another stone in the growing wall Rachel was building against her. While the legal battle simmered in the background, Rachel prepared for the next round of public pressure. She knew Karen would try to sway the court of public opinion against her. Sure enough, within days, rumors began to circulate. People whispered that Rachel had built illegally, that she was threatening to sue the neighborhood, that she was hostile to the community's values. Rachel didn't dignify the lies with responses. Instead, she stayed visible, calm, and polite. She attended neighborhood meetings, stood in line at local shops, smiled at passing joggers. She made herself a fixture, unmovable, undeniable. Karen could spin whatever stories she wanted, but Rachel would not be erased or marginalized through gossip. Still, the stress gnawed at her. Coming home each evening felt different now. The comfort she had built into her little sanctuary was tainted, invaded by the awareness that eyes were watching, that hostility simmered just beneath the surface of polite greetings and tight smiles. Her once idyllic retreat had become a battlefield disguised in manicured lawns and cheerful porch lights. Rachel installed security cameras, discreet but effective, covering every inch of her property. She upgraded her home insurance, added legal riders for harassment coverage, and filed formal notices with the city documenting the ongoing vandalism and threats. Every step was methodical, deliberate, another layer of armor. Karen's next move, however, showed how desperate she was becoming. One evening, Rachel returned from work to find city workers standing around her front yard, measuring tape in hand, grim expressions on their faces. Confused, she approached and introduced herself. One of them, a tired-looking supervisor, explained they had received an anonymous complaint about illegal expansion onto public easement property. They were required to investigate. Rachel forced herself to stay composed. She invited them inside, offered them copies of her permits, her survey records, her original deed. The supervisor examined the documents carefully, compared them against their own records, and after nearly an hour of measuring and cross-referencing, confirmed that Rachel was well within her legal boundaries. No violations. No citations. The workers left, and Rachel stood on her porch watching the sun set behind the trees, feeling a surge of grim satisfaction. Every time Karen attacked, she exposed more of herself. Anonymous complaints left trails. False claims could be subpoenaed. Rachel was building a case that stretched far beyond property lines and neighborhood disputes. A case that could very well cost Karen more than just her reputation. Rachel's insurance adjuster finally completed his report and delivered an unexpected gift. In his assessment of the patio destruction, he noted damages that extended beyond personal property. Damages that impacted the shared drainage system under the public access easement. That meant city infrastructure had been compromised. Rachel filed a copy of the adjuster's findings with the city planning office and sent a formal notification to the municipal maintenance department. Within 72 hours, city inspectors arrived to survey the damage. This wasn't just about her anymore. Now it involved public works. Karen's grip on the situation began to slip visibly. Her smile, once so smug and serene, became strained, brittle. She avoided Rachel whenever possible, sent her husband, a pale, nervous man who looked like he regretted every choice that had brought him here, to speak at community events in her place. The whisper network shifted subtly. People who had once been eager to join Karen's side in gossip started hedging, distancing themselves, murmuring that perhaps things had gone too far. A few brave neighbors even approached Rachel quietly, offering apologies, information, or simply silent gestures of support. A nod, a wave, a moment of genuine eye contact. Rachel accepted their overtures with quiet grace but trusted none of it. She wasn't here to win a popularity contest. She was here to reclaim what was hers, to expose the rot festering behind the pristine facades of suburban life, and to make sure that anyone who thought to cross her learned just how dangerous it was to mistake silence for weakness. The final blow in this first phase came unexpectedly and powerfully. The private investigator, digging deeper into the financials tied to Gordon and Sons, found a witness. A former temp worker who had been hired for the demolition job and who, disillusioned and unpaid for his last 2 days of work, was willing to talk. Under recorded interview, he described how a lady from the neighborhood, a large woman with short blonde hair and a fancy accent, had met the crew in the early morning hours, pointed out the property, and instructed them on exactly what to tear down. He described her car, her voice, even the way she barked orders and laughed when they accidentally knocked down part of the adjacent public pergola. Every detail matched Karen Winslow perfectly. Rachel's attorney moved quickly, securing the testimony and preparing formal affidavits. With this witness, the financial records, the destruction documented by police reports and insurance adjusters, and the trail of false complaints, they were ready to file civil action not just for property destruction, but for harassment, fraud, and public endangerment. As Rachel sat at her kitchen table finalizing the paperwork with her attorney, she allowed herself a rare smile. Karen had tried to bury her under fear and noise. She had used lies, manipulation, and cowardice, believing they would be enough to defeat a woman who lived and breathed conflict for a living. She had gambled that Rachel, like others before her, would fold when the pressure grew unbearable. But Rachel Blake wasn't built to fold. She was built to fight, cleanly, efficiently, and without mercy when the time was right. And now, finally, the time was almost here. Rachel knew better than to expect a clean, silent collapse. People like Karen Winslow did not surrender quietly, and Rachel anticipated the backlash long before the first cracks in Karen's facade appeared. Filing the lawsuit was not the end. It was the beginning of a new phase, one where the pressure would ratchet higher with every day that passed. She braced herself for the retaliation, the dirty tricks, the desperate flailing that came when someone's carefully curated power structure began to crumble. She didn't have to wait long. Within a week of the civil complaint being served, Rachel noticed the subtle signs of coordinated pushback. Anonymous notes appeared in her mailbox typed on cheap paper filled with vague threats about making the neighborhood unlivable. Her trash bins were knocked over 3 mornings in a row, their contents deliberately scattered across her driveway. A smear of raw egg dripped down her front door one Sunday morning. Childish tactics, petty vandalism that would have seemed almost laughable if not for the underlying message: you are not welcome here. Rachel documented everything meticulously. She photographed every incident, logged every disturbance with time and date, filed supplemental police reports, and forwarded each one to her attorney. Every minor infraction added weight to her claims, building a mountain of evidence that would make it impossible for Karen to pretend innocence. But harassment wasn't the only weapon Karen deployed. In a move so bold it bordered on suicidal, she attempted to weaponize the very administrative bodies Rachel had carefully worked within. An emergency community meeting was called, allegedly to discuss neighborhood standards and safety concerns. Flyers were distributed to every mailbox except Rachel's. She learned about it only because a sympathetic neighbor quietly slipped a copy under her door. Rachel attended, of course, arriving early, armed with documents, a calm demeanor, and a mind sharpened by years of courtroom experience. The meeting was a farce from the beginning. Karen presided over it with a brittle smile and an iron grip, framing every discussion around vague allusions to troublesome developments and residents who did not respect the community's spirit. No one mentioned Rachel by name, but everyone knew exactly who was being targeted. Rachel waited until the open floor session before rising slowly from her seat. She did not shout. She did not accuse. Instead, she presented the facts: the original survey of her property, the city permits authorizing her construction, the police reports documenting vandalism, the findings from her insurance company about damage to public infrastructure, the witness statement tying Karen directly to the illegal demolition. She spoke clearly, precisely, offering copies of the documents to the meeting recorder. The room, previously abuzz with tension, fell into stunned silence. Karen blanched visibly but managed to stammer out a rebuttal, something about misunderstandings, procedural mistakes, and well-meaning concerns. But the damage was done. The spell of her authority was broken. People who had nodded along with her rhetoric shifted uncomfortably in their seats, eyes darting between her and the neat stack of documents Rachel had left on the table. No one rushed to defend her. No one volunteered to support her narrative. Rachel didn't linger. She collected her materials, offered a brief professional nod to the moderator, and left the meeting hall without looking back. She knew better than to expect instant vindication. Fear and loyalty ran deep in small communities, and Karen's web of influence would not unravel overnight. But seeds had been planted, doubt had been sown, and Rachel understood that in battles like these, erosion was often more powerful than demolition. Over the following days, the shift became undeniable. Karen's allies became less vocal. Conversations that used to stop abruptly when Rachel entered a room continued, albeit awkwardly. Invitations to neighborhood events that once conspicuously excluded her began to quietly reappear in her mailbox, as if pretending the past months of hostility had never happened. Rachel accepted none of them, not out of bitterness, but because she understood that true safety would not come from superficial gestures of reconciliation. It would come only from structural change, from stripping away the informal power that had allowed Karen to operate unchecked for so long. Meanwhile, the city's involvement deepened. The report filed by Rachel's insurance adjuster had triggered a broader investigation into neighborhood oversight practices. Inspectors began showing up unannounced to evaluate community spaces, public works maintenance, and records of permits and approvals. Rachel watched from a distance as city officials toured the common areas, clipboard in hand, occasionally shaking their heads or scribbling furious notes. She didn't need inside information to know what they were finding: decades of informal arrangements, sloppy bookkeeping, unapproved expenditures. Karen's reign had been built on a foundation of informal favors and whispered agreements, And now the scrutiny of officialdom was tearing that foundation apart plank by rotten plank. Karen, for her part, responded exactly as Rachel had predicted. She retreated into a defensive crouch, railing against external interference and malicious actors. She tried to rally the neighborhood, painting herself as a victim of outsider harassment. But the more she spoke, the more desperate she sounded. Her righteous fury rang hollow against the stark clarity of official reports and documented facts. Her attempts to stir outrage only highlighted her fear. Karen's real power had never been formal. It had lived in the space between rules, in the assumptions and courtesies people extended because it was easier than confronting her. Now that space was shrinking, strangled by the very systems she had once flouted. Rachel maintained her course with relentless, quiet efficiency. She continued to press her lawsuit, added supplemental claims based on the ongoing harassment, and responded to every provocation with professional detachment. She understood that endurance was as much a weapon as evidence. Karen's tactics, disruption, intimidation, misinformation, thrived on emotional reaction. Denying her that reaction was like denying oxygen to a fire. One evening, a breakthrough came not from a confrontation, but from an unexpected source. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Langford, who had lived on the street for nearly 40 years, knocked on Rachel's door just after sunset. Rachel, wary, answered cautiously, "But Mrs." Langford's expression was earnest, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a worn manila envelope. She explained in a voice quivering with anger and regret that she had found the envelope in her late husband's filing cabinet while cleaning out old documents. It contained correspondence, real letters, not emails, from Karen Winslow dating back nearly a decade, detailing informal decisions about property boundaries, unrecorded votes, and self-authorized changes to community policies. Rachel accepted the envelope carefully, understanding immediately its significance. It was a time capsule of systemic abuse, a window into the backroom dealings Karen had used to build and maintain her informal empire. Letters signed, dated, and unmistakably in Karen's hand, outlining decisions that should have been made publicly, properly, and with full transparency. The evidence was explosive. Not only did it support Rachel's case, but it opened the door to broader inquiries that could implicate Karen, and possibly others, in years of improper governance, misappropriation of funds, and even civil liability. It was the kind of revelation that could end not just Karen's influence but her financial stability and legal safety. Rachel thanked Mrs. Langford with quiet sincerity, promised to safeguard the documents, and closed the door behind her with a slow, measured breath. This changed everything. This wasn't just about one vindictive neighbor anymore. This was about systemic rot, and now Rachel had the proof necessary to excise it at its root. She sat at her dining room table late into the night, reviewing the letters under the soft glow of her lamp, assembling a timeline, cross-referencing details, building the foundation of a case that would not only end Karen's campaign against her, but would change the neighborhood forever. Her patio could be rebuilt, her peace could be restored. But the greater victory, the one that would echo long after the lawsuits and inspections were over, would be this: a community freed from the tyranny of one woman's ego, a system reforged with transparency and accountability at its core. Rachel knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Karen would fight back with every ounce of venom she had left. But now, Rachel wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, bullied, or coerced into submission by people like Karen. And that kind of fight, righteous, necessary, inevitable, was one Rachel Blake had been preparing for her entire life. Rachel had anticipated resistance, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer desperation that Karen would unleash once she realized her empire was truly crumbling. If the earlier tactics had been amateurish harassment and social isolation, what followed now was full-scale, scorched earth. Karen, backed into a corner, chose to lash out in ways that were as reckless as they were self-destructive. It began subtly. Notices from the city about supposed code violations started arriving at Rachel's door in rapid succession, each more absurd than the last. Overgrown shrubs, allegedly, excessive exterior lighting, a fabricated complaint, an unapproved mailbox color, a pure fiction. Each accusation required time, energy, and sometimes fees to address, and although Rachel handled each systematically, filing formal responses and securing dismissals, the cumulative strain was undeniable. Karen was trying to bleed her dry, not with one catastrophic strike, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. Rachel responded by escalating in kind, though not in the same sloppy emotional way Karen did. Her attorney filed motions expanding the scope of their lawsuit to include harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. Each retaliatory complaint, each false report became another brick in the wall Rachel was building to crush Karen under the weight of her own actions. But Karen wasn't finished. Late one night, Rachel returned home from a strategy meeting with her lawyer to find that her backyard had been vandalized again. Not with structural damage this time, but with something more insidious. Someone had dumped industrial fertilizer across her lawn and gardens, burning ugly, blackened patches into the grass and killing dozens of plants. The smell was sharp, chemical, unmistakable. Rachel didn't even hesitate. She called the police, filed another report, and immediately arranged for environmental testing to confirm the nature of the chemicals used. She wasn't just documenting vandalism now. She was building a case for environmental damage, a far more serious and heavily penalized offense. She sent her landscaper to inspect neighboring properties, noting carefully that Karen's own yard showed suspicious signs of recent maintenance. Fresh grass seed, newly installed sprinklers, all classic tactics used to cover evidence of fertilizer. Misuse. The landscaper, a gruff old man with decades of experience, didn't mince words. She knew exactly what she was doing, he said grimly. This wasn't random. This was a hit job. Rachel continued to gather evidence methodically. She purchased a small hidden trail camera and installed it overlooking her backyard under the cover of night, careful to position it where it would catch any unauthorized visitors. She upgraded her security system again, linking it directly to a private monitoring company rather than relying solely on local police. She informed her insurance company of the escalating threats, ensuring that if the worst happened, she would have full coverage, and a paper trail proving she had taken every reasonable precaution. Rachel wasn't just reacting anymore. She was fortifying. Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic as well. She filed a countersuit against Rachel, alleging defamation and emotional distress. It was a laughable document, riddled with contradictions and unsupported claims, but Rachel treated it with the same seriousness she treated every threat. She answered swiftly, thoroughly, and with documented evidence. Her legal team filed a motion for dismissal and a request for sanctions against Karen for filing a frivolous lawsuit, turning Karen's own desperation into another legal liability. Meanwhile, Rachel's private investigator uncovered even more damning evidence. Financial records linked Karen's husband to several shady property management firms, companies known for buying distressed properties at foreclosure sales and flipping them for massive profits. It was a clear motive. If Rachel were driven out, if her home fell into legal or financial jeopardy, it could easily be snapped up at a bargain price. Karen wasn't just motivated by spite. There were real financial incentives underlying her campaign of harassment. This revelation opened new legal avenues for Rachel to pursue: claims of tortious interference with economic advantage, conspiracy to commit fraud, and possibly even RICO violations if a broader pattern could be demonstrated. Rachel's case, once a narrow dispute over property destruction, had blossomed into a sprawling, multifaceted legal assault. And yet, amidst all the legal maneuvering, Rachel never lost sight of the personal cost Karen's war was exacting. Every day she came home to her damaged yard, every time she had to meet with lawyers or city inspectors, every sideways glance from a neighbor still loyal to Karen chipped away at the peace she had worked so hard to build. It was a psychological siege as much as a legal one. But Rachel endured, not because she enjoyed conflict, but because she understood that conceding would only embolden predators like Karen to do the same to others. Then came the turning point, an unexpected gift wrapped in the most unlikely of packages. One evening, as Rachel was reviewing documents in her living room, her doorbell rang. She hesitated, wary, but checked the security feed first. Standing there, shuffling nervously from foot to foot, was a teenager she recognized vaguely as one of Karen's neighbors. Rachel opened the door cautiously, keeping the security chain engaged. The boy, barely more than 16, thrust a thumb drive through the gap and muttered, "You didn't get it from me." Before Rachel could ask anything, he bolted down the steps and disappeared into the night. Rachel closed the door, locked it, and took the thumb drive straight to her laptop. What she found stunned her. It was video footage, shaky, amateurish, clearly shot on a phone, showing Karen in her backyard during the night of the fertilizer attack. The grainy footage captured her distinctive silhouette, her heavy frame, and unmistakable voice barking orders to someone off camera as they unloaded bags of chemicals. The timestamps matched the vandalism perfectly. Rachel's hands trembled slightly as she backed up the footage in 3 different secure locations, made copies, and immediately forwarded it to her attorney. This wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore. It was direct, visual proof of Karen committing an environmental crime. It would devastate her legal position, obliterate any remaining community support, and likely subject her to serious criminal charges. The reaction was swift and brutal. Rachel's legal team filed an emergency motion to amend their lawsuit to include new claims based on the video evidence. Simultaneously, the police initiated a criminal investigation into Karen's actions, and environmental authorities were notified about the illegal use of hazardous materials on private and possibly public land. Karen's world, once so stable and smugly invincible, began to collapse visibly. Process servers appeared on her porch with new court orders. Police cruisers parked outside her home. City inspectors pored over her property with clipboards and cameras, documenting every violation they could find. Rachel didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Victory wasn't about humiliating Karen publicly, though that was an inevitable side effect. It was about restoring the balance, about making sure that power, once abused so flagrantly, was checked and dismantled systematically. But even as the noose tightened around Karen, Rachel remained vigilant. Desperate people did desperate things. She strengthened her home's security further, adjusted her routines to avoid predictability, and kept her closest friends informed of her movements. She was winning, but she knew better than to relax before the final judgment fell. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the queen of the cul-de-sac fell from her throne. Neighbors who once cowered under Karen's glare now crossed the street to avoid her. Once cheerful brunches hosted at her house evaporated. Handwritten notices about community events no longer bore her name. Bit by bit, she became a ghost. Present but untouchable. Isolated by the very people she had once ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a pastel sweater. Rachel, for her part, stayed quiet. She rebuilt her yard, replanted her gardens, and restored her patio. She reclaimed her space, not with fanfare or victory laps, but with the same quiet, deliberate determination that had carried her through the worst of the battle. She knew the legal fight wasn't fully over yet. Trials, judgments, and enforcement actions would still unfold. But the tide had turned irreversibly. Karen Winslow had underestimated Rachel Blake in the worst possible way. She had mistaken kindness for weakness, silence for submission, resilience for fragility. Now she was paying the price. And Rachel, steady, relentless Rachel, was just getting started. The day of the court hearing arrived under a low, gray sky, the kind that seemed to press down on the city like a weight, heavy and unrelenting. Rachel Blake stood outside the courthouse, her heels firmly planted on the concrete, her case file clutched under one arm, her mind a steel trap of preparation. She had dressed plainly, professionally, a dark blue suit and modest heels, no flair, no spectacle, because today wasn't about theatrics. Today was about facts, precision, and letting Karen Winslow's downfall unfold naturally, without embellishment or drama. Her attorney met her at the courthouse steps, a wiry man with a clipped tone and a sharp eye who had spent the past months assembling a case so tightly wound that there was virtually no room for error. Rachel trusted him implicitly, and as they exchanged a silent nod before entering the building, she felt a calm settle over her, the same cold focus she used to summon before arguing high-stakes cases in her previous life. Inside the courtroom, Karen was already seated with her own attorney, a large, blustering man who wore an ill-fitting suit and sweated profusely even before the proceedings began. Karen herself looked diminished, her usual bombastic presence shriveled into something brittle and fragile. Her hair, once meticulously styled, hung limp around her face. Her clothes, while expensive, seemed ill-chosen, the colors too loud, the fit too tight, as though she were trying to armor herself in the only thing she still controlled. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, never resting on Rachel, never settling long enough to offer any real challenge. It was a clear signal. Karen had finally realized the gravity of what she was facing. The judge presiding over the case was a stern woman in her late 50s, with a reputation for intolerance toward procedural games and emotional grandstanding. Rachel knew this was to her advantage. The hearing moved quickly through the preliminary motions, with Rachel's attorney outlining the scope of damages, the evidence of harassment, the environmental violations, and the broader campaign of intimidation that Karen had orchestrated. Every claim was backed by documentation: photographs, timestamps, witness statements, police reports, forensic analysis of the fertilizer damage, video footage, financial transactions linking Karen to the fake demolition crew. Each piece layered over the last until the entire picture became inescapably clear. Karen's attorney flailed in response, attempting to argue that Rachel had exaggerated the incidents, that neighborhood disputes were common and should be resolved privately, that Karen had been provoked. But his arguments rang hollow against the weight of evidence Rachel's team had built. The judge interrupted him several times, pressing for specifics he couldn't provide, and visibly frowned as he stumbled through his statements. It was not going well for them, and everyone in the room knew it. When it came time for Karen to testify, the moment Rachel had waited for, she watched with clinical detachment as the woman who had terrorized her for months took the stand. Karen's voice trembled as she answered the initial questions. She tried to maintain her composure, framing herself as a concerned neighbor who only wanted to preserve the community's standards. But under cross-examination, her facade cracked. Presented with her own correspondence, her bank withdrawals, and, most damningly, the video footage showing her orchestrating the fertilizer attack, Karen stumbled, contradicting herself multiple times. At one point, faced with the footage, she tried to claim it was unclear and could be someone else entirely, but the judge quickly shot down that line of defense, noting the distinctiveness of Karen's voice and build. By the time the closing arguments began, Karen looked hollowed out, her shoulders sagging, her hands gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Rachel sat silently throughout, her face composed, betraying none of the storm of emotions roiling beneath the surface. She felt no glee, no triumph, only a deep, resonant satisfaction that justice, slow and brutal, was being served exactly as it should be. The judge recessed briefly to review the final exhibits, and the courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Rachel stared straight ahead, willing herself to remain steady, to let the culmination of her months of meticulous work unfold without interference. When the judge returned, her expression was severe, unreadable. She summarized the findings bluntly. The evidence against Karen was overwhelming. Her actions were intentional, malicious, and demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment and property destruction. The court ruled in Rachel's favor on every count. Karen was ordered to pay full restitution for the property damage, including triple damages for the environmental violations, as well as punitive damages for harassment and emotional distress. In addition, the court imposed a permanent restraining order, prohibiting Karen from any further contact or interference with Rachel or her property. The financial judgment was staggering, enough to force the Winslows to liquidate assets, perhaps even sell their home. Karen's lawyer slumped in his chair, defeated, while Karen herself sat frozen, as though the reality of her downfall was too vast for her mind to comprehend all at once. Rachel didn't stay to watch the aftermath. As soon as the session ended and the judge left the bench, she rose, gathered her papers, and walked calmly from the courtroom. She felt the eyes of others on her as she passed. Curiosity, sympathy, perhaps even admiration, but she didn't react. This was not a victory to celebrate publicly. This was a war that had been fought quietly, methodically, and won through sheer force of will. Outside, the air was cooler, fresher, as though the storm that had pressed down for so long had finally broken. Rachel paused for a moment at the top of the courthouse steps, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. She allowed herself a small smile, fleeting and private, before composing herself once again and descending into the city below. The legal battle was over, but the rebuilding of her home, her peace, her community, was just beginning. Word of the verdict spread quickly through the neighborhood. Rachel noticed the change almost immediately. The same neighbors who had once averted their eyes or whispered behind their hands now offered cautious smiles, brief nods of acknowledgement. Some were genuine, some were motivated by self-preservation, but Rachel accepted them all with the same measured distance. She wasn't interested in retribution or forced camaraderie. She had fought her battle not to become queen of the cul-de-sac, but to reclaim her right to live quietly and without fear. Karen's downfall was swift and total. Within weeks, a "for sale" sign appeared in front of her house. The Winslows disappeared almost overnight, their departure marked not by the grand farewell party Karen might have once imagined, but by the silent arrival of a moving truck in the dead of night. No one came to see them off. No casseroles, no sympathy cards, just the sound of boxes being loaded into a truck under the indifferent watch of a neighborhood that had moved on without them. Rachel continued her life with deliberate simplicity. She finished restoring her backyard, planting new gardens, repairing the scarred earth with patient hands. She participated in neighborhood meetings when necessary, advocating quietly but firmly for transparency and fairness in community governance. Over time, she built something far more enduring than a patio or a lawsuit victory. She built a reputation as someone who would not be bullied, who would not be silenced, who stood her ground when it mattered most. And perhaps most importantly, Rachel reclaimed the quiet dignity of living on her own terms, without fear, without compromise, without the constant shadow of someone else's petty tyranny looming over her. The weeks after Karen's departure passed with an almost surreal quietness, as though the neighborhood itself was exhaling after holding its breath for too long. Rachel noticed the difference immediately. The streets felt lighter, conversations with neighbors more natural, without the subtle tension that had previously laced every interaction. People lingered longer on their front lawns, chatted freely in the evenings, and although Rachel never sought to become the center of attention, her presence no longer carried the invisible weight of a controversy. She had not merely won a legal case, she had shifted the balance of the entire community by standing her ground and refusing to be cowed into silence. Her days slowly returned to a rhythm she had almost forgotten she needed. Mornings began with coffee on her newly restored patio, the sunlight spilling across clean wood planks and fresh green plants replacing the scorched remains of her old garden. Evenings were spent walking through the winding streets, where the houses now felt less like fortresses and more like homes. She exchanged casual greetings with people she had once only nodded at from a distance. Some offered cautious smiles, others tentative waves, as if trying to rebuild bridges they had been too afraid to extend before. Rachel accepted these small gestures without bitterness, understanding that fear had kept many silent when they should have spoken. She did not carry grudges. She carried lessons. The physical signs of the conflict faded quickly. The damage to her yard was repaired. The security measures she had installed became less about vigilance and more about routine safety. But deeper changes remained. The neighborhood association, once an opaque and exclusionary body, underwent a quiet transformation. New elections were held without Karen's dominating influence skewing the results. Fresh faces appeared in leadership roles, people who valued transparency and fairness over petty control. Meetings shifted from covert backroom dealings to open forums where all residents had a voice. Rachel attended not out of ambition or desire for recognition, but because she understood that vigilance was the price of peace. Real change required participation, even if that participation was often thankless and exhausting. One afternoon, as she pruned the roses along her fence, a car pulled into the driveway next door. Rachel paused, watching as a young couple stepped out, their faces bright with excitement and nervous energy. They had purchased Karen's former home, though Rachel doubted they knew much about its history beyond whatever sanitized version the realtor had offered. She wiped her hands on a towel and crossed the lawn, offering a warm, non-committal smile as they unpacked a few boxes from their trunk. The woman, petite with curly brown hair, looked up and smiled back, genuine and open. "Hi there. We're the Matthews," she said brightly. "Just moved in. Looks like we've got a lot of work ahead of us." Rachel extended her hand without hesitation. Rachel Blake, welcome to the neighborhood. There was no need to speak of the past, no need to poison their new beginning with old battles. The best revenge was not in recounting the wars won, but in living well, building something stronger atop the ruins left behind. In the following months, Rachel watched the neighborhood continue its quiet evolution. New families arrived, bringing with them the energy of fresh starts and new traditions. Old resentments faded, replaced by a cautious optimism that perhaps things really could be better. The memory of Karen Winslow lingered in small ways. A cautionary tale exchanged in hushed tones, a ghost story told among the more seasoned residents about the dangers of unchecked power and silent complicity. But it no longer defined the community. It had become history, not prophecy. Rachel herself found a renewed sense of purpose beyond the borders of her home. She joined a local volunteer group focused on urban gardening and environmental restoration, finding satisfaction in watching things grow, in nurturing life where once there had been only conflict and decay. She offered legal advice pro bono to residents dealing with bureaucratic hurdles, helping them navigate a system she knew all too well could be turned into a weapon if left unchecked. Her life was not glamorous, not headline-grabbing, but it was honest, grounded, and deeply, quietly satisfying. Sometimes, late at night, Rachel would sit alone on her patio, a glass of wine in hand, the soft hum of the neighborhood settling into sleep around her. She would look up at the stars, so much brighter here without the city's smog and noise, and allow herself to feel the enormity of what had been accomplished. Not just the victory over Karen, but the reclamation of her own peace, her own space, her own right to exist without fear. That, she knew, was the real triumph. Not the lawsuits, not the financial penalties, not even the reforms she had helped spark, but the simple, unassailable fact that she had refused to be moved. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, had carved out a place for herself where no one, not Karen, not anyone, could ever again make her feel small. Rachel Blake had not set out to be a hero. She had set out only to protect what was hers. But in standing firm, in refusing to bow to intimidation, she had become something larger. A quiet, steady reminder that true strength is not in the noise we make, but in the lives we choose to live, no matter who tries to take them from us.